Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to show you how to automate the process of creating test profiles using customer data from an Excel distribution list, all with UiPath. If you have ever had to manually copy and paste rows, updating the customer details just to send test eDMs for stakeholders to approve, you know how tedious that can be. In today's video, I am going to solve it by locating the last row in each Excel file, duplicating it, updating the PII information with test profile data. This is super helpful if you have to send test emails, also at the same time test out the dynamic fields using real customer details, but without showing the PII information. So if you're ready, let's dive in. Before we begin creating our workflow in UiPath, I want to show you the dataset we're going to use today. In this Excel file, we have 2 sheets, and in each sheet, we have 4 columns: email, contract number, contract expiry date, and region. What we are going to do today is to get UiPath to find the last row in each sheet, duplicate that row, and then replace the email address with our test email address. The first step of our workflow is to get the Excel file that we are going to use. So the first activity we need is the Excel application scope activity. So let's find the Excel application scope. If you can't find this activity, you need to install the package from Manage Packages. So we need to get our testing Excel file. And the next activity we need is the get workbook sheets activity, so that we get all the workbook sheets in the Excel file. And then we read all sheets in to a variable called list of sheets. Control K. Oops. And then the variable type should be list of string. Now we have a list of sheets from the Excel file. The next thing we need to do is to loop through each sheet and then read the data in each sheet. So to do that, we need the for each loop. So for each, we name the item name as sheet. So for each sheet, and remember to change this into string. So for each sheet in list of sheets, we will then read the data. So we need an activity called read range. And we change this into sheet. And we read the data into a data table. We'll call this DT tame, as we are going to save this into a temporary data table. which we will then copy into a main data table. So we need another data table that will call it DT main. So we will first need to initialize the main data table by using if statement. And then we will say in the condition, we will create the main data table as a variable, and we will select data table as a variable type. And how we're going to initialize it is to say if DT main is nothing. So if it's empty, then we will clone DT temp into DT main. So we use assign activity, and we will save DT temp dot clone into DT main. In the next step, we will look through each row in data table and then check whether the index of that row equals to the index of our last row. So what we're going to do is to get an activity called for each row in data table, and then we will look through each row in DT temp and then check the index of that row. But before that, let's assign a new variable for our index. So I'll create a new variable for the index of our last row, and I'll name this variable as last row index. Control K, and we need to set this as integer. And then to get the index of our last row, we need to count the number of rows in our DT temp by using rows dot count and then -1. That is because the index of each row starts from 0. So to get the index of our last row, we will count the number of rows and then -1. And the next things we need to do is to check each row and see whether the index of that row equals to the index of our last row. So we will use the if statement, and then in the condition we will say DT temp dot rows dot index of that row equals to last row index. So if the condition is true, then we will add a new data row with the array of our last row. So we will duplicate our last row into our DT main. So we will use the activity called add data row, and then we will add this DT temp dot rows
And then we will specify the index of our last row, which is last row index. And then we'll get the item array of that row. And then we output it into our DT mean. So now we have added the duplicated row into our DT mean. The next thing we need to do is to replace the email address with our test email address. So how we're going to do it is to use the assign activity, and then we can save the new value to the value in our last row. So we need to get the last row from DT main and use the method as enumerable, and then dot last, and then we need to specify the column name, which is email. So we'll get the email column in our last row, and then we'll set the value to, let's set the value to abc@gmail.com. So now we have duplicated the row and then replace the value. The last thing we need to do is to write it into our Excel file. So we need the write range activity, and we will use the same sheet name, and the data table will be DT main. And we will change the starting cell to the starting cell of the row after the last row. So I'll still use the A, but I'll change 1 to the row after the last row. So I'll count the number of rows in DT theme. The rows dot count plus 2. That is because we have header and then we have the new row. So we will plus 2 so that we write the value after our last row. And then remember to convert it to string. And then we are pretty much done, but the very last thing I want to do is to clear the temporary data table after we are done. So I'll play after the for each row. I'll clear the DT temp. And that's it. Let's run this workflow and see what we get. Voila, we can see the duplicated row in the row after our last row, and then we can also see the value in our email columns has been replaced with our test email address. And we can check the rest of the values are the same as our last row. And then let's check the other sheet is the same. We have duplicated the last row and then we have replaced the value.
And that's it. You have just got yourself an automated way to generate test profiles without exposing the PII information. And no more copy and paste. If you found this useful, please give it a like, subscribe for more automation tips, and drop a comment below if you want me to cover more scenarios like this. Thanks for watching. Happy automating. See you next time. Ciao.